J.D. Vance, the vice president, said the agent who shot Renee Good was protected by absolute immunity.
What is the precedent for that, and why shouldn't the Minnesota officials on the ground have access and evidence to work on this investigation?
First of all, I wish the state officials in Minnesota would investigate why you have so many people who are using their vehicles and other means to actually interfere with a legitimate law enforcement operation. The precedent here is very simple. You have a federal law enforcement official engaging in federal law enforcement action. That's a federal issue. That guy is protected by absolute immunity. He was doing his job. The idea that Tim Walz and a bunch of radicals in Minneapolis are going to go after and make this guy's life miserable because he was doing the job that he was asked to do is preposterous. The unprecedented thing is the idea that a local official can actually prosecute a federal official with absolute immunity. I've never seen anything like that. It would get tossed out by a judge.
That's what the Vice President of the United States said. He should know better. And they have deliberately cut funding for offices at DHS that monitor the conduct of immigration officers to protect civil rights and civil liberties. They are giving agents a license to kill with impunity. Secretary Noem should be fired immediately. If not fired, impeached. Stephen Miller has now tried to point the finger at others when he has been the ringleader in the White House. He should be fired. DHS operates at the direction of the White House, of the president, with orders to meet arbitrary quotas, to detain and deport, not just the worst of the worst, but anybody. They conduct mass raids in unmarked vehicles and refuse to show identification. They arrest people without warrants, use force to enter homes, and lock people up without due process. They sweep up citizens, legal immigrants, and immigrants without deportation orders. And when they're confronted with their abuses, they lie. They tell us not to believe what we see with our own eyes. Mr. President, I want to salute the people in Minneapolis and across the country, including in Maryland, who are taking videos and working to hold these federal forces accountable. Think about what would have happened if there was no video in these cases. These videos have complicated the Trump administration's effort at a cover-up, even as the Trump administration refuses to work with state and local law enforcement to investigate these killings. In my state of Maryland, DHS lied about the circumstances surrounding a non-fatal shooting. And they were exposed in their lies because of a local county investigation that showed that DHS was plain wrong. DHS has restricted access to detention centers, preventing congressional oversight into inhumane conditions where we know at least 30 people have died in custody, including one death in Texas that has been ruled a homicide. And as they view the actions of peaceful protesters and observers as a personal offense, they've reacted with violence and labeled them domestic terrorists for practicing their constitutional freedoms and rights. In Minnesota, these federal agents hurl chemical irritants at peaceful crowds who are simply exercising their First Amendment rights to freedom of assembly and peaceful protest. They view whistles as weapons. In Portland, they claim to be threatened by people wearing frog costumes. My colleagues, Republicans in Congress, have fueled this surge in illegal activity by exploding the DHS budget with $165 billion as part of what Donald Trump called the big, beautiful bill. Remember, that's the bill where the richest people in the country were given permanent tax cuts. That's the bill that made deep cuts in health care for tens of millions of Americans. And in that bill was also this huge slush fund for DHS. ICE by itself is now the nation's highest funded law enforcement agency. and has more funding than the militaries of most countries in the world, including Italy, Israel, and Brazil. ICE by itself has more funds than the armies for those countries. And now they're spending those funds to hire more agents and putting more of them out on the streets with limited training. They're preparing to turn warehouses into so-called processing sites and detention centers, including one in my home state of Maryland, doing it against the will of the community. We see DHS spitting in the face of local communities across the country. In Maryland, we had a rally with hundreds of people on a very cold day, sending a message to ICE and to the Trump administration that the people in that community did not want a warehouse for detainees right there. Within days of that demonstration, the Trump administration, ICE, signed a deal where they purchased for $100 million of our taxpayer money to purchase a warehouse where they say they can keep up to 1,500 detainees. I can tell you Maryland taxpayers don't want their monies going to that purpose. And I'll bet you the great majority of taxpayers around this country don't want to see their tax dollars used in that way as well. And now, despite the fact that they're already clearly misusing these taxpayer dollars as American citizens are killed on the streets, our fellow Republicans, our Republicans in the Senate, want to give them even more in the bill that would be up on this floor this week. In fact, another $10 billion more for ICE and over $18 billion more for Customs and Border Patrol, while refusing to rein in these abuses. Another blank check for lawless activity, another blank check that results in the killing of Americans, another blank check with no accountability. That would be madness. We cannot greenlight the actions of an agency that is already terrorizing our communities and executing our neighbors with billions of dollars in new funds without any regard to their constitutional rights. Again, President Trump said he was going to go after the worst of the worst. That has not been their focus, and we can see it with our own eyes. And we cannot accept the administration's claim that these agents have some kind of absolute immunity and are free from the consequences of their action. That's why an independent investigation into the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy has to happen. And I appreciate my colleagues from the other side of the aisle who have called for one. But that should be a standard situation. That should be the standard operating procedure in a situation like this. State and local law enforcement should, of course, be partners in that effort. The Fed should not be trying to hide evidence from those local and state law enforcement officers. We must do that, but it's not enough to take the word of the Trump administration that they will do that. We can't simply trust an administration that has repeatedly lied to the American people, as if this time they will try to do better. And again, we wouldn't be here probably but for that video. The administration would have thought that it got away with its lies. So let's not be naive. We're not going to give away our responsibility as legislators to put real reforms right into the DHS bill to prevent this lawlessness, to prevent these killings, to protect our freedoms, and to assure real accountability. Our most important job is protecting the life and liberty of the American people. It's sadly too late to protect Alex Preddy and too late to protect Renee Good, as they should have been protected. but it's not too late to act on behalf of the rest of the American people. So this week, we have before us a package of appropriation bills that includes the work of 6 appropriations subcommittees, including defense, transportation, housing, labor, health and human services, foreign operations, and financial services. These are not perfect bills, and I have serious concerns with some of them that I would like to see addressed. But it's also clear that there's enough support in this body to pass them. We could pass them today if they were separated out. In fact, when those bills went through the House of Representatives, they considered the Department of Homeland Security bill on its own merits. They didn't bundle it in with everything else and say, you know, you gotta vote for this whole package at one time. So the House, after they passed it individually, they pulled all those bills together and sent them in a bundle over here to the United States Senate. But my goodness, that doesn't mean the United States Senate has to take it that way from the House. This is supposed to be an independent branch of the Congress. I don't know why we would surrender our responsibilities to the House of Representatives, and they should get right back into Washington if we change this bill and pass it to prevent a shutdown of those agencies. That's their responsibility. Mr. President, the House needs to perform its duties, and we need to perform ours. And ours involve making sure that we separate out those 5 appropriation bills that I mentioned from the Homeland Security appropriations bills. In fact, I would argue that we should also take, as part of the package of 5 bills, we should take FEMA and TSA and the Coast Guard, which are part of the DHS bill. And we could send all of those back to the House for immediate passage to go on to the President. But instead, Republican colleagues here are wasting time. We could take up that package today if there was the will to do it among my Republican colleagues. But right now, instead, we're holding all of those other agencies, the Defense Department, Health and Human Services, hostage to holding on to the Department of Homeland Security bill that needs to be changed dramatically. I don't think that a single person in this body would argue against deporting those who have committed serious crimes, the worst of the worst. But that is not what this administration has been focused on. Nothing about this has been targeted. And Trump's ICE is not focused, as they promised, on the worst of the worst. They're stopping and arresting people who are citizens, who are legal residents, who have legal pending asylum claims, just because of how they look or their accent. And they're wreaking havoc on communities across the country, including on peaceful protesters, two whom have now given their lives to protect our freedoms. And you know what? They're not just using their own agents as part of this indiscriminate dragnet. They're bringing in other agencies as well, distracting them and redirecting them from critical missions. Senator Warner released data that showed that nearly half of the FBI agents in its largest field offices have been redirected to immigration away from fighting drug trafficking, terrorism, and violent crime. Mr. President, it's time for us in the Senate to do our job. This isn't going to go away with the couple hours of extra training, personnel reassignments, or administration statements. Let's make this a moment for real change and not give DHS another huge blank check. I, for one, will not vote for one more dime for this lawless DHS operation that we're witnessing at this time. And I yield the floor.